In this quick clip, we're going to be looking at the modern historian debate on the characters of the emperors, and we're going to focus on the likely arguments of a modern historian about the character of the Julio-Claudian emperors. They're most likely to focus on the key personality traits. So Tiberius as a tyrant, Gaius as mad, Claudius is weak and dominated by his freedmen and by his wives, or Nero as just a lunatic. And you're going to have to pick out key arguments of what the modern historian says and find ancient sources to agree and to disagree. So we're going to look at the most likely arguments that a modern historian would use when discussing these Julio-Claudian emperors. In this clip, we're going to be looking at Tiberius. Is Tiberius the tyrant Suetonius and Tacitus make out that he is? Certainly there are counter-arguments, and none more so than the historian Velleius. So if we pick up Tiberius's discussion of his reign, we've got to make note that first of all, we've got the removal of Augustus's grandson and possible rival, Agrippa Posthumus, who's executed pretty much as soon as Tiberius becomes emperor. Tacitus also notes that Tiberius denied giving the order and that the officer that committed the murder, basically nothing happened to him. Now, where we really see Tiberius's reign getting off to a negative start is with his accession speech to the Senate, where Tiberius, trying to play Augustus, tries to look reluctant to assume the position and the powers that he's being given. Tacitus does try and show that Tiberius is being cryptic and really trying to test the attitude of the leading men. And really that's a theme of Tacitus's coverage of Tiberius as being quite a cryptic ruler. The accession speech, certainly in Tacitus, is contradictory. On the one hand, Tiberius rejects excessive titles, but on the other hand, reinforces the treason trials. Similarly, in Suetonius, we've got this feigned reluctance, where supposedly Tiberius pretends that he's not really willing to accept the title of emperor, and also, at the same time, consolidates his position with the Praetorians. Obviously, we've got to consider the army mutinies as well, which we'll discuss in another clip, and whether Tiberius's actions in dealing with the army mutinies are successful or not. He sends, if you remember, Drusus and Germanicus to go and deal with them. Tacitus gives us loads of detail. And even though those mutinies are dealt with, Tacitus is still pretty critical of Tiberius for sending half-grown boys to go and deal with the threat. One key aspect of a modern historian discussion about Tiberius might actually focus on Germanicus himself and his wife Agrippina, and certainly whether Tiberius and Germanicus' relationship was as negative as our sources are making out to be. Germanicus, after the Germanic mutinies, is sent east, and whilst in the east he obviously has to deal with the Armenians, but importantly starts to commit several actions which would have angered Tiberius: entering Egypt without permission, giving out public grain without permission, and having his image cast on coins. And it's for this reason that Tiberius supposedly asked the governor of Syria, Piso, to monitor Germanicus' actions. Germanicus tragically dies, and his wife Agrippina blames Tiberius. She believes that Tiberius ordered Piso to murder her husband, and that is the start of a whole range of issues and tension between Agrippina and her sons and her faction and Tiberius. Another aspect that a modern historian might focus on is Sejanus, and certainly Sejanus is a really important influence on Tiberius. As Tiberius becomes more and more frustrated with the Senate, he retreats to Capri and leaves Sejanus in charge. According to Suetonius and Tacitus, Sejanus becomes so influential that he's basically the emperor and Tiberius is this offshore monarch. Tiberius does refer to him as the partner of my labours. And the Tacitus quote sums it up perfectly. The emperor himself became tyrannical or gave tyrannical men power. Another aspect of Tiberius a modern historian could focus on would be his retreat to Capri. Here we've got a reconstruction and then the modern day image of what goes on here. And Suetonius is really great for all of the juicy gossip and the rumour that supposedly goes on in Tiberius's private pleasure island. Suetonius that tells us that he retires there after the death of his son. Obviously, at this point, he's unaware that Sejanus and his relationship with Livilla has probably resulted in the death of his son. And really, Suetonius is really quite critical because he says that Tiberius utterly neglected the conduct of state affairs. So he's really, really critical. And in verse 43 and verse 45, we get some of the real gossip, racy gossip that's in Suetonius about what Tiberius was getting up to on this island. Obviously, prior and then just after the fall of Sejanus, we have the issue of the treason trials, which any modern historian would focus on as well. Were they as brutal as Suetonius and Tacitus describe? Well, certainly Seneca, writing later on, says that they cost the lives of more Roman citizens than any civil war. And certainly Tacitus would corroborate what Seneca's saying. You remember, of course, Seneca, tutor of the Emperor Nero, probably trying to draw a contrast. Tacitus talks about how commenting on anything was to risk prosecution, and pretty much even if you had a famous name, that threatened death. However, in 23 years, 52 people only charged, 12 put to death. We do have in Suetonius and Tacitus Tiberius committing some ridiculous cases, and certainly under Sejanus's influence, this is where that really builds up. Some executions, but deaths also due to other reasons. Is the Tacitus and the Suetonius discussion of the treason trials a remembrance of the extreme fear amongst the upper classes? The important thing with whatever a modern historian discusses about Tiberius and whether they're focusing on the negative aspects, you must always contrast that with Velleius. Velleius, who's a contemporary writer, obviously there's issues with whether he's able to write freely or not, but he's really positive about Tiberius as an emperor, saying that he restored respect for public life, conspiracy was eliminated, the Senate enjoyed its majesty, the consuls and the praetors gained their authority back. He's excellent in terms of the control of the plebs and the grain price, despite what Suetonius and Tacitus say. Excellent with the provinces. And on the Sejanus front, Velleius thinks it's perfectly acceptable to have a deputy because Tiberius is just following the precedent set by Augustus having Agrippa. He also says that Germanicus had been well trained, and then crucially, from a positive aspect of Tiberius's character and reign, he's generous and even saves senators from poverty. So the important thing is when looking at any extract about Tiberius is to pick out what the points are being said and then what negatives of Suetonius and Tacitus and positives of Velleius you can use to discuss those points.